She served him divorce papers at the Christmas dinner table, champagne already poured, her family already laughing, completely unaware that the quiet man she was discarding owned a $58 billion oil company, and that every single thing her brother had built his career on was sitting on ground that man's father had paid for, decades before any of them ever said his name wrong. That is the story. A man who spent 10 years being treated like a footnote in his own marriage. A wife who performed her exit in front of an audience. A mother who called his father small time. A brother who built a brokerage on a foundation he never once thought to investigate. And a locked iron box sitting on a closet shelf that every one of them walked past without knowing it held the instrument of their complete and total destruction. Here is the question that will keep you here for the next 50 minutes, when a man already holds everything, when the power was his before the humiliation even started. What kind of patience does it take to wait for exactly the right moment to use it? If that question already has you locked in, hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second, and it tells us to keep these stories coming. Subscribe if you are new here, because this is what we do. And drop your city in the comments. Where are you watching from today? We want to know exactly where in the world this story is landing tonight. Now let me take you back to where this all began, a Christmas Eve dinner in Dallas, Texas, a table full of people who had spent years underestimating the same quiet man, and an envelope that everyone in that room believed was the end of something, when in truth, the house on Millbrook Drive smelled like pine garland and pot roast, and every light inside it was burning. Everett Sims sat at the far end of the dining room table, the end closest to the kitchen, farthest from the chandelier, with a glass of sweet tea he had poured himself, and a plate he had quietly assembled without asking anyone to pass anything. That was how he had learned to move in this house over 10 years of Christmas Eves, efficiently, without drawing attention, without requiring anything from anyone that they might resent giving him. The table seated 14. Simone had arranged the seating herself, the way she arranged everything in her life, with precision and intention and a clear sense of who belonged where. Her cousins Brenda and Tasha were closest to her, bookending her side of the table. Her Aunt Gloria had the seat with the good view of the television. Yvette sat at the head because Yvette always sat at the head, even in a house that belonged to someone else. Everett sat at the other end. He did not mind the arrangement. He had stopped minding arrangements like that somewhere around year 4. What he did instead was watch. He watched the way Simone laughed, mouth wide open, head tilted back, performing the laugh as much as feeling it. He watched Yvette hold court in her cream-coloured blouse and her pearls, dispensing opinions the way a judge dispenses rulings. He watched the cousins track Simone's energy, matching her register the way backup singers match a lead. He noticed things. He always had. It was the one habit of his that Simone had never been able to train out of him. The front door opened at 7:43, and Craig Beaumont entered with the specific energy of a man who believed that every room improved upon his arrival. He was 39 years old, broad-shouldered, in a wool blazer that fit well enough to have been expensive. His Porsche key fob hit the entry table with a sound that was not accidental. Yvette's whole face opened up the moment she heard it, the way it always did when Craig walked into a room like a window being lifted on a warm afternoon. He embraced his mother first, then Simone. He shook hands around the table with the practiced ease of someone who had been performing competence for so long it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. When he reached Everett, he gave him the nod, the one that said acknowledged without saying welcomed. Everett nodded back and took a sip of his tea. Yvette waited until the pot roast had been served, and the cornbread was half gone before she said what she had been holding since at least the drive over. She was talking about one of Simone's former colleagues, a woman named Diane, who had just listed a 40-acre commercial parcel in Frisco. And she said, with the serenity of someone making an observation about the weather, that it was remarkable what a woman could accomplish when she was properly supported, when she was with someone whose ambitions matched her own. She did not look at Everett when she said it. She did not need to. Brenda and Tasha smiled into their plates. Craig reached for more cornbread. Simone let a small, satisfied expression cross her face before she smoothed it back to neutral. Everett looked down at his plate. He picked up his fork. He had long ago learned that absorbing a thing was not the same as accepting it. Simone stood up 12 minutes later. She had the timing of a woman who had rehearsed. She waited until the table was at full attention, until Gloria had finished her story about her neighbor's new car, until the cousins had quieted, until the only sound in the room was the gospel station playing low from the kitchen speaker. Then she stood, and she smoothed the front of her dress, and she reached beneath her chair for the manila envelope she had placed there before anyone arrived. She walked the length of the table without hurrying. She set it down in front of Everett with both hands, the way you set down something you have decided you no longer need. She said that she had been doing a lot of reflection. She said that she had come to understand herself better over the past year and what she needed in a partner. She said that she had met someone, a developer named Preston, someone aligned with where she was going, and that she believed, truly believed, that this was the right thing for everyone. Craig lifted his champagne glass. Yvette touched her pearls. The cousins looked at each other with the barely contained delight of people watching something they had been briefed on in advance. Everett looked at the envelope for a moment. Then he opened it. He read the first page and the second with the same unhurried attention he gave everything. He aligned the pages carefully and set the stack face down beside his plate. Nobody at that table noticed the open office door behind him. Nobody noticed the iron lockbox on the closet shelf, visible through the gap, sitting exactly where it had sat for 4 years, dark and small and completely unremarkable, with Simone's weekend bag hanging on the hook directly below it like a flag planted in ground she did not own. Everett refolded his napkin. He placed it beside his plate with the same care he had used his entire life with things other people had stopped seeing. He excused himself quietly, thanked Gloria for the cornbread, and walked through the kitchen to the back door. The cold air off the driveway hit him clean and flat. He sat in his car for a few minutes with the engine off and both hands in his lap, looking at nothing in particular. Then very slowly he allowed himself a small breath. What the family was celebrating in that warm, bright dining room, what they were lifting their glasses to, what they were so satisfied about, Everett had been quietly, patiently preparing for longer than any of them would ever know. To understand what happened at that Christmas table, you have to go back further than Christmas. You have to go back 10 years. Everett met Simone at a rooftop gathering in uptown Dallas, the kind of party where everyone was dressed for the version of themselves they were still working toward. He had been invited by a colleague. She had been there with girlfriends. He noticed her first, the way she commanded the space around her without appearing to try, the way she laughed at exactly the right volume. He was 34 years old and genuinely, completely taken. She noticed him too. Later she would describe it to her friends as noticing his steadiness. He was not loud. He was not performing. He stood near the edge of the rooftop with a drink he barely touched and watched the city the way a man watches something he finds genuinely interesting. Simone had spent enough time around men who needed to be looked at that a man who didn't stood out like a clean note in a cluttered chord. They dated for 14 months. He was attentive and unhurried and honest in a way that felt at the time like a foundation. The first year of marriage was fine in the way that first years often are, full enough of logistics and novelty to keep the deeper questions quiet. But by year 2, something had shifted in the way Simone looked at Everett. Not a dramatic shift, a gradual one, like a painting slowly tilting on a wall. She had started attending more industry events, moving through circles where the husbands were louder, the watches were larger, and the conversations were about deals rather than work. She came home from those evenings quieter than she left. She had started measuring. And Everett, measured against men whose entire identities were built on display, kept coming up the same way, quiet, steady, and in Simone's new accounting, insufficient. Yvette did not help. Sunday dinners at Yvette's house on Fernwood Lane were a weekly institution, the kind of ritual that felt like family, but functioned like a courtroom. The table was always beautiful, pot roast in the good dish, sweet tea in the crystal pitcher, peach cobbler cooling on the counter. But the warmth in that house moved in a specific direction, and it always moved toward Craig. Craig had opened Beaumont Mortgage Solutions at 31 and spent every Sunday dinner since then narrating its expansion. A new hire, a record month, a corporate client he could not name but whose value he could imply. Yvette received each update with the particular pride of a woman who had decided long ago which of her children was her investment and which was her comfort. She loved Simone, but she believed in Craig. Everett sat at those Sunday dinners and ate his pot roast and said the right things when asked, and was otherwise not factored into the arithmetic. His silence was not discomfort. He was by nature a listener. But Simone had stopped understanding the difference between a man who had nothing to say and a man who was simply choosing not to say it. In her mother's dining room, surrounded by the weekly evidence of Craig's momentum, that distinction had become invisible to her. 3 years into the marriage, Craig bought the Porsche. Yvette mentioned it 4 Sundays in a row. Everett drove the same Accord he had owned since his late 20s. He had never seen a reason to change it. The podcast was year 6. Simone had been invited onto a Houston lifestyle program, a show aimed at professional women, self-described as a space for real conversations. The host, a woman named Keisha, who had built a following by asking the questions other people danced around, got to the marriage within the first 15 minutes. She asked Simone what it was like being a high-achieving woman with a partner who operated at a different level. Simone laughed first. Then she said that Everett was comfortable but not ambitious. She said it warmly, the way you say something you have been privately thinking for so long that it no longer feels cruel, just accurate. She said she had learned to appreciate what he offered and release expectations of what he didn't. The host nodded with the knowing sympathy of someone who understood completely. Everett never told Simone he had heard the episode. A colleague had sent him the link with no comment. He listened to it once in his car in the parking garage of an office building in Las Colinas, then set his phone in the cup holder and sat with it for a while. Then he drove home. He visited his father in Beaumont twice a year, every year without fail. Once in spring, once before the holidays. Simone referred to these trips as him going to see the old man, and eventually stopped asking when he would be back, because the answer was always the same. He would be back Sunday evening. Wendell Sims was 70 years old and did not own much that was visible. He lived in a modest house on a modest street and drove a truck that was 11 years old and kept a vegetable garden in the side yard that he tended with the same methodical patience he applied to everything. He and Everett would eat together, watch the game, talk about nothing urgent, and everything important. The lockbox arrived by courier on a Tuesday in early November, the year Wendell had his first serious heart episode. It was iron, dark, with a small latch and no combination. A regular envelope was taped to the top. Inside the envelope, in Wendell's handwriting, deliberate and slightly slanted, the hand of a man who had learned penmanship from a serious teacher, was a single sentence. "Keep this close and don't open it until I'm gone." Simone came home to find it on the kitchen counter. She picked it up, turned it over, set it back down. She said it looked like something from a garage sale. She said it did not go with anything in the house. 2 weeks later, Everett found it in the box she had assembled for a Goodwill donation run, tucked between a lamp she had decided she no longer liked and a set of placemats that had gone out of style. He lifted it out without comment. He carried it to his home office and placed it on the top shelf of the closet, behind a stack of binders, where it sat for the next 4 years without being touched or discussed or acknowledged by anyone in that house. Simone hung her weekend bag on the hook directly below it. She walked past it every time she needed a suitcase. She walked past it on the way to the Good Coats. She walked past it approximately 800 times over 4 years, and she never once looked up. What she saw as clutter, Wendell Sims had spent 30 years building from the ground up. One lease, one agreement, one drilling permit at a time in the heat of the Texas coast, with no audience and no announcement, and no interest whatsoever in being seen. He and Everett had more in common than either of them ever needed to say out loud. Wendell Sims died on a Tuesday in October, 14 months before that Christmas Eve dinner. Everett got the call at 6 in the morning from Wendell's neighbor, a retired pipe fitter named Roosevelt, who had lived next door for 30 years and still called Everett Little Man, even though Everett was 44 years old. Roosevelt said it was peaceful, said Wendell had gone in his sleep, in his own bed, in the house he had paid off in 1998, and never once thought about leaving. Everett sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment after he hung up. Then he got dressed quietly, went downstairs, and made himself a cup of coffee. He stood at the kitchen window and drank it while the city outside was still dark. He did not wake Simone. He wrote her a note instead. 4 words on the back of a takeout receipt, the only paper he found quickly. Gone to Beaumont, back Sunday. He left it on the counter next to the coffee maker and drove south on the interstate, while the sky was still the color of ash. When he told Simone that evening, after he had already made the preliminary arrangements and driven back, she received the news with the efficiency of a woman triaging a schedule disruption. She asked about the funeral timeline. She asked whether she would need to take time off. She asked once if he was okay, and when he said yes, she moved on to the question of what to wear, and whether the drive to Beaumont was worth it, or whether they should look at flights. They drove. At the repast in the fellowship hall of Wendell's church, Simone stood near the door with her arms crossed and her phone tilted slightly toward her palm. She spoke when spoken to. She ate nothing from the table. She was gone from the conversation before it ended, and from Beaumont before dark. Yvette called Craig 2 days after the funeral. Everett did not know the content of that call until much later, but he eventually learned what was said. Yvette told Craig that Wendell's passing, while unfortunate, at least meant the end of those Beaumont trips. She said Everett had always seemed more attached to that old man than to his own wife, and that this was, in its way, a clarifying development. Craig agreed, in the way that Craig agreed with his mother about everything that did not cost him anything. Everett opened the lockbox 3 weeks after the funeral. He waited until Simone was out of the house, out of the city, at an industry conference in Austin that she had mentioned twice and described in detail. He went to his home office, reached to the back of the closet shelf, and brought the lockbox down with both hands. He set it on his desk. He found the small flat key on Wendell's keyring, which Roosevelt had handed him at the house, and he opened it. Inside he found 3 things. The first was a document he recognized as a controlling interest certificate, the kind of formal instrument that confers ownership over a privately structured business entity. The company name at the top read Sims Gulf Holdings, LLC. His own name was printed below it as sole beneficial owner. The second was a handwritten letter, 2 pages, in Wendell's deliberate slanted hand. Everett read it twice, slowly. He would not describe its contents to anyone for months. What he understood from it, in broad terms, was that his father had built something significant, far more significant than he had ever indicated, and that he had chosen invisibility deliberately as a philosophy, not a circumstance. The letter said that Everett would know when the time was right to understand what he was holding. The third was a Gulf Coast land survey dated 1987, showing a portfolio of commercial properties across the Dallas-Fort Worth energy corridor. 3 of them were circled in red pen. Everett sat with those 3 items for a long time. He did not fully understand the scale of what he was looking at. He was an energy consultant by trade. He understood the industry, understood asset structures, understood what a lean portfolio meant in broad terms. But the number implied by the certificate, by the scope of the survey, by the institutional language of the documents, was a number so large that his mind kept sliding off it like water off stone. He put everything back. He closed the lockbox. He placed it on the shelf. He contacted no one for 3 months. During those 3 months, Simone began appearing in public with Preston. She introduced him to Yvette at a Sunday dinner Everett did not attend, citing a work call he had stretched by 30 minutes on purpose. Yvette, by all accounts, approved immediately. Preston was broad-shouldered, well-dressed, and talked about his development projects the way Craig talked about his deals, loudly, confidently, with the specific energy of a man who needed the room to know he was doing well. Craig, during those same 3 months, closed the largest single transaction in the 4-year history of Beaumont Mortgage Solutions. A commercial property portfolio in the energy corridor exurbs $12 million in origination value, underwritten against collateral that included a lien encumbered parcel whose senior note holder was listed on the paperwork as a silent LLC entity Craig had processed without examining further. He told Yvette about the deal on a Sunday. He said it was the one that changed everything. Everett heard about it second-hand through Simone, who mentioned it the way she mentioned Craig's wins, as contrast, as evidence, as a measuring stick held up against the quiet of her own house. He heard it. He filed it. He sat with the lockbox and the survey and the letter for a little while longer. And then, on a Thursday evening in late November, with the house empty, and the city outside doing what cities do, he picked up his phone and dialed the number for a Dallas attorney named Gerald Okafor, whose name he had found through a referral in the energy sector, a man described to him simply as precise and trustworthy and not given to wasted time. The call lasted 11 minutes. What it would eventually produce would take 14 more months to fully arrive, but it was already in motion. It was already, quietly, irrevocably, in motion. 2 weeks after Christmas, Everett Sims carried the lockbox out of the house for the first time. He set it on the passenger seat of his Accord, buckled his seatbelt, and drove downtown. The city was still wearing its holiday slowness. Thin traffic, offices half empty between the holidays. He found parking 2 blocks from the address Gerald Okafor's assistant had sent him, and walked the rest of the way with the lockbox under his arm, the winter air cutting through his jacket like it had somewhere to be. Okafor and Associates occupied the 14th floor of a glass building on Commerce Street. The reception area was quiet and deliberately plain. No artwork trying too hard, no furniture designed to impress. A woman at the front desk directed Everett down a carpeted hallway to a corner office where Gerald Okafor was already standing, waiting, with the stillness of a man who did not consider time a commodity to be wasted. Gerald was 57 years old, broad across the shoulders with close-cropped grey at his temples and reading glasses folded into his breast pocket. He had spent the first 20 years of his career as in-house counsel for two of the largest energy firms in the Gulf Coast region before opening his own practice. He shook Everett's hand once, firmly, and gestured toward the chair across from his desk. He did not ask how Everett was doing. He simply said, "Let's start with what's in the box." Everett opened it. He laid the 3 documents on the desk in the order he had found them. The certificate first, then the letter, then the survey. Gerald put on his reading glasses and reviewed each one without speaking. He turned pages. He cross-referenced something on his computer. He went back to the certificate and read it a second time. Then he took his glasses off and set them on the desk. He said that Sims Gulf Holdings was a privately structured limited liability company organized under Texas state law, with Wendell Sims listed as the founding member and Everett Sims designated as the sole beneficial successor upon the founder's death. He said the company held active drilling rights on 11 producing sites across the Gulf Coast and the western Permian Basin. He said the most recent independent reserve valuation, conducted 18 months prior, had placed the company's proven asset value at approximately $58 billion. $58 billion. Everett sat with that number in the room for a moment. Gerald kept going. He said that Wendell had been meticulous about one additional element of the company's structure: a lean portfolio. Over the course of 20 years, Sims Gulf Holdings had acquired senior lien holder positions on a collection of commercial real estate parcels in the Dallas-Fort Worth energy corridor, parcels whose value had appreciated significantly as the corridor developed. The liens were held under a subsidiary entity called Meridian Lien Partners, organized specifically to obscure the beneficial owner from public search. Gerald opened a manila folder and placed 3 commercial property files on the desk, side by side. He said that a brokerage operating under the name Beaumont Mortgage Solutions had originated loans against all 3 of those properties over the past 4 years. He said the name on the origination documents in every case was Craig Beaumont. Everett looked at the files. He looked at Craig's name, printed cleanly on forms Craig had signed without once looking up to ask who held the senior position above him. Gerald was not finished. He said there was one further item of relevance. In reviewing Beaumont Mortgage Solutions' operating credit facility, a line of credit issued through a regional commercial lender, he had found a personal guarantee co-signed by a Simone Sims, listed on the document under her professional designation as a licensed real estate agent in the state of Texas. Everett went still. Gerald explained the chain in plain terms. The lien calls, if executed, would place Craig's commercial paper in technical default. The default would expose Craig's operating license to regulatory review by the Texas Department of Savings and Mortgage Lending. The operating credit facility, in default, would activate the personal guarantee, and the personal guarantee would pull Simone's real estate license directly into the same compliance exposure that was about to swallow her brother. One action, 3 consequences, a chain Simone herself had volunteered to be part of when she co-signed that document as a family favor, probably on a Sunday after dinner, probably without reading past the first paragraph. Gerald folded his hands on the desk and asked one question. "What do you want to do?" Everett did not answer immediately. He looked at the survey, at the 3 properties circled in red pen, at the careful, deliberate marks his father had made with a ballpoint sometime in 1987, when Everett was 6 years old, and the Permian Basin was just a place his daddy drove to before sunrise. He looked at his father's handwriting on the letter beside it. plain and slanted and unhurried. He thought about the podcast. He thought about the toast. He thought about the word small time and who had said it and how many times. He thought about the lockbox on the shelf, the 4 years it sat there, the Goodwill box, the weekend bag hanging on the hook beneath it. He looked up at Gerald. He said, "I want to do exactly what my father would have done. Nothing fast, nothing loud, nothing they can undo." Gerald held his gaze for just a moment longer than necessary. Then he reached into his desk drawer and produced a fresh legal pad. He uncapped his pen and set the tip to the top of the first line. And he began to write. Gerald's legal pad filled up over the course of the next 3 weeks, not with emotion, not with strategy in the dramatic sense, no speeches, no confrontations, no grand gestures. What filled those pages was sequence, timing, the precise legal architecture of a collapse that would look from the outside like a series of unrelated business misfortunes arriving in unfortunate succession. Gerald was methodical the way a surgeon is methodical, not because he enjoyed the work, but because he understood that precision was the only thing that made the outcome permanent. The sequence was this: the lien calls first, the license flag second, and Simone's co-signature exposure third. Each step separated from the next by 10 to 14 days. The spacing was intentional. Gerald explained it to Everett plainly. If 3 disasters arrive on the same day, a man like Craig looks for a common cause. If they arrive 2 weeks apart, he spends the interval trying to solve the first problem before the second one lands. By the time he understands they are connected, he is already too far down to climb back. The lien calls would be filed under Meridian Lien Partners, the Sims Gulf subsidiary, whose name appeared on the original paperwork and whose beneficial owner was nowhere in any public record. Craig had signed loan documents referencing that entity 4 times over 4 years. He had never once looked it up. He would see a company name, he would not see a person. Gerald handled the filing himself. He did not delegate it. He reviewed every document twice before signing, and when Everett asked if there was any exposure, any legal angle Craig's attorney might use to challenge the calls, Gerald said the structure was airtight because Wendell had made it airtight 30 years before either of them had reason to care. Everett signed 3 authorization documents in Gerald's office on a Thursday afternoon in late January. He used a pen Gerald handed him without ceremony, signed where indicated, and set the pen back on the desk. That was the moment the clock started. He did not feel triumphant. He felt clear. The following Saturday, Everett drove to Beaumont alone. He did not tell anyone he was going. He did not have a meeting or an obligation. He drove because there was something he needed to see before the consequences he had set in motion began to arrive, something he needed to stand in front of and remember. Wendell's original Permian lease site was 40 minutes outside of Beaumont, on a 2-lane road that ran between flat scrub and low sky. The equipment on the site was no longer Wendell's. The land itself was under a long-term operational lease to a larger firm. But the parcel boundary was the same parcel his father had first negotiated rights to in 1974, a 22-year-old man with a borrowed truck and a belief that what was underground was worth more than what was visible above it. Everett parked on the shoulder and stood outside his car for a while. The wind off the plain was steady and cold and smelled faintly of sulphur and dry grass. He thought about his father standing in this same spot 50 years ago, but not celebrated, not announced, not particularly noticed by anyone, and choosing to build something anyway, something real, something that did not need anyone's approval to be worth $58 billion. He stood there long enough that the cold worked through his jacket. Then he got back in the car and drove. In the weeks that followed, 2 additional items were handled. The first was the formal establishment of the Wendell Sims Community Foundation. a $50 million philanthropic endowment organized under Texas nonprofit law, with a specific mandate to fund scholarships for first-generation college students from the Beaumont region pursuing careers in the energy sector. Gerald processed the paperwork. Everett reviewed and signed. The foundation was filed quietly, without announcement, without press release. The second item was a single phone call. The Dallas Community Connector, a neighborhood newsletter that had been publishing for 22 years, distributed in print and online to roughly 40,000 households across the metro area, had run Yvette's interview in its December issue. The piece was titled "A Woman Finally Choosing Her Worth." Yvette had been photographed in her living room in the cream blouse she wore to formal occasions, and she had been quoted at length on the subject of her daughter's courage in leaving a marriage that had constrained her potential. Everett called the newsletter's editor and introduced himself as the director of a newly established foundation he believed would be of interest to their readership. He offered an exclusive profile. He provided no details beyond the foundation's name and general purpose. He said the timing was flexible, but that the story would be significant when it was ready. The editor said yes. Everett thanked her and ended the call. He did not respond to Simone's attorney. He did not initiate or accelerate the divorce proceedings. He paid the household bills, as he always had, on time, without commentary. To anyone watching from the outside, he was a quiet man absorbing a difficult situation with his characteristic lack of drama, which was exactly what he had always been. On the 44th day after Christmas, Gerald called Everett at 8 in the morning to confirm that the first certified notice had left his office the previous afternoon, addressed to Beaumont Mortgage Solutions, attention, Craig Beaumont, sent by standard first-class mail. No urgency, no special marking, nothing on the outside of the envelope to suggest what was inside it. Just a letter, travelling through the ordinary mail, on its way to a man who had made a toast at a Christmas dinner table and had no idea that the ground beneath everything he had built was already shifting. Craig would have it in his hands within 2 days. He would not understand what he was holding until it was far too late to put it down. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Craig found it in the morning stack between a vendor invoice and a client follow-up, standard white envelope, no special marking, return address listed as Meridian Lean Partners with a post office box in downtown Dallas. He set it aside twice before opening it. He had 3 calls before noon and a lunch meeting he'd been building toward for 6 weeks. The envelope did not look urgent. He opened it at 11:17 between calls. He read the first paragraph, then he read it again. The notice informed Beaumont Mortgage Solutions that Meridian Lean Partners, as the senior lien holder of record on 3 commercial properties in the Dallas-Fort Worth Energy Corridor, was formally exercising its right to call the outstanding lien obligations on all 3 parcels, simultaneously, effective, immediately, pursuant to the terms of the original line instruments. The total value of paper in question was $14,700,000. The notice cited specific legal provisions. It was signed by a representative of Okafor and Associates, counsel of record for Meridian Lean Partners. Craig set the letter down on his desk. He picked up his phone and called his title company. The woman he reached pulled the parcel records while he waited. She confirmed that Meridian Lean Partners held senior position on all 3 properties. She confirmed the lien instruments were valid and properly recorded. She said the calls were legitimate. Her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone delivering information they did not want to be responsible for. Craig's collateral was compromised. He called his lender next. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. By the end of it, the tone on the other end of the line had changed in a way that Craig recognized. The shift from a lender talking to a client to a lender talking to a liability. His $14 million commercial paper portfolio was being flagged for technical default review. The lender said they would be in touch. Craig sat in his office chair and stared at the letter. He called the number listed for Okafor and Associates. A receptionist answered, confirmed that the firm represented Meridian Lien Partners, and said that all correspondence should be directed to the address on the notice. She was polite. She was also completely unhelpful. He called Simone. She was between showings and answered on the second ring with the distracted energy of someone who had better places to be. He explained the notice. He used the deal language he always used. Some kind of lien issue, probably a clerical thing. Just needs to get sorted. Simone told him to call his attorney and stop panicking. She said it was fixable. She said these things happened in commercial real estate all the time. Craig called his attorney. His attorney, a man named Terence Webb, who had handled the brokerage's legal work for 3 years, asked Craig to photograph the documents and send them over. Craig did. 40 minutes later, Terence called back. The call did not go the way Craig expected. Terence said the notice was not a clerical error. He said the lien instruments were structurally valid and the call was legally permissible under the terms Craig's own clients had signed. He said the senior position held by Meridian Lien Partners gave them precedence over every other interest in those properties. He said that Craig's exposure was real, that the lender's default review was a direct and foreseeable consequence, and that the most pressing immediate question was whether Craig had any personal exposure connected to the brokerage's operating credit line. Craig's stomach dropped. He tried Meridian Lien Partners directly, called the post office box number, sent a formal written inquiry by email, attempted to reach anyone at the entity who could explain the basis for the action or discuss a resolution. Nothing came back. Not a response, not an acknowledgement, not even an automated reply. Meridian Lien Partners was not interested in a conversation. That evening, Craig drove to his mother's house on Fernwood Lane. Yvette opened the door before he reached the porch. She had heard his car, and she looked at his face and said nothing for a moment. She led him to the kitchen, where the remnants of dinner were still on the stove. She fixed him a plate he didn't touch. She sat across from him while he laid out everything: the notice, the lender's call, the attorney's assessment, the silence from Meridian. Yvette listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for exactly the length of time it took her to decide what she believed. Then she said what she always said when the world failed to behave according to her understanding of it. She said it was a mistake. She said someone was confused or overreaching or had the wrong paperwork. She said Craig had built something real, something legitimate, something nobody had any business coming after. She straightened in her chair with the authority of a woman who had run a school for 30 years and believed that authority translated to every domain. She told him to get himself together. She told him that nobody comes for people like them without a reason, and they hadn't done anything wrong. Craig nodded. He drove home. He told himself she was probably right. By the next morning, 2 of his largest referral partners had already heard. The Texas Department of Savings and Mortgage Lending flagged Craig's license on a Monday morning. He found out from his own assistant, who had taken the call. By Wednesday of that same week, the first referral partner had stopped returning messages. By Thursday, the second had sent a 2-line email citing an internal policy about not working with brokerages under active regulatory review. Craig called both of them. Neither picked up. Friday, a third partner, a commercial lending officer named Dwayne, who had sent Craig 6 figures in business over 3 years, filed a formal complaint with the state licensing board citing undisclosed conflicts of interest in 3 shared transactions. Craig's attorney called it a coverage move. Dwayne was protecting himself. The Porsche sat in the parking lot of Beaumont Mortgage Solutions like a symbol of something that no longer existed. Simone got her notice on a Tuesday. She was in the middle of a showing, a 4-bedroom in Frisco, young couple, second visit, the kind of appointment that usually ended with an offer. Her phone started lighting up in her blazer pocket while she was pointing out the breakfast nook. She excused herself. She walked to the back patio and stood in the February cold and read the certified mail notification on her screen. Her co-signature on Craig's operating credit line had triggered a personal liability assessment. Her real estate license was being placed under compliance review by the Texas Real Estate Commission, effective immediately, pending the resolution of the default proceedings against Beaumont Mortgage Solutions. She stood on that patio for a long time. She went back inside and finished the showing. The couple said they would think about it. They did not make an offer. 3 days later, her broker called her into a meeting. The sellers on her 3 pending luxury listings had requested reassignment to other agents, quietly, professionally, without stated reason. The broker said it with the careful tone of someone who understood exactly what was happening but preferred not to say it directly. Simone's listings, a combined value of $4.2 million in pending commission, were transferred to 2 other agents in the office by the end of the week. Simone called Preston that evening. She got his assistant. The assistant said Preston was unavailable but would return her call at the earliest opportunity. He did not return her call. By week 12, his assistant sent a 2-line email explaining that Preston had decided to focus on existing commitments and wished her well. Simone read it 3 times, looking for something that wasn't there. Her network, the one she had announced from the Christmas dinner table, the one she had built her entire identity around, the one she had cited as the reason Preston had been interested in her at all, was declining his calls. She had nothing to offer him anymore. Yvette's newsletter interview started circulating the same week. Someone had screenshotted the original article, "A woman finally choosing her worth." Yvette in her cream blouse, the pull quotes about Simone's courage and potential, and posted it side by side with the licensing board notice that had made its way onto a Dallas real estate industry forum. The caption read, "How's that worth looking now?" It spread through a specific corner of the Dallas professional community with the quiet, devastating efficiency of information. People are glad to have an excuse to share. Yvette stopped looking at her phone. Everett saw none of this firsthand. He did not monitor news feeds or social media. He did not call anyone who might have information. Every Friday morning, Gerald sent him a single paragraph by email, clinical, factual in the past tense, summarizing the week's developments. Everett read each one once. He did not respond. He went about his week, made his coffee, handled his work, and waited with the same patience he had been practicing for a decade. The summaries were enough. Craig spent 2 weeks trying to trace Meridian Lean Partners. He pulled every public record he could access. He hired a data researcher for $400. He eventually got far enough to confirm that Meridian was a registered subsidiary of a parent entity called Sims Gulf Holdings, and that Sims Gulf Holdings was represented exclusively by Okafor and Associates of Dallas, Texas. He brought this to Simone on a Thursday evening at her apartment. He laid the papers on her kitchen table. He walked her through the chain step by step, the way his attorney had walked him through it. He said the name of the parent company. He said the name of the law firm. He watched her face as the connections assembled themselves. Simone went completely still, the way a person goes still when the floor moves under them and they are trying to determine if it will hold. Craig said the name out loud one more time, slowly, to make sure she had heard it. Sims Gulf Holdings. Simone picked up her keys. She drove to Millbrook Drive without calling ahead. She parked at the curb in front of the house that still had both their names on the mortgage, the house she had left willingly and triumphantly 9 weeks ago. She turned off the engine. Everett's Accord was in the driveway. She sat in her car and looked at it. She sat there for 11 minutes. Then she got out, walked to the front door, and knocked on the door of the house she had been so certain she was done with. Everett had been expecting her. He opened the door before she knocked a second time. He had heard her car, he had heard the engine cut off, and the silence that followed, and the 11 minutes of her sitting out there working up whatever she thought she needed to walk through that door. He had used those 11 minutes to set the kitchen table the way he wanted it, the lockbox open at the center, the documents arranged in the order they told the story, the 1987 survey on top with its 3 red circles facing outward where anyone sitting across from him could see them clearly. He opened the door. He stepped aside. He said nothing. Simone walked in. She looked at the kitchen table and stopped. She looked at the open lockbox and the papers fanned out around it, and something moved across her face that she could not fully contain. Not fear exactly, but the cousin of it. The recognition that the room had been prepared for her arrival. That none of this was accidental. She sat down across from him. She started talking in the register she used when she was managing a transaction. She talked about the compliance review being something that could be addressed, about Craig's situation being separate from hers legally, about the divorce proceedings moving forward in a way that would be fair to both parties. She used words like resolution and going forward and mutual benefit. She spoke for almost 4 minutes without stopping, the way a person speaks when they are afraid that the silence waiting for them on the other side of their words will be worse than anything they can say. Everett let her finish. He waited until she had run completely out of road, until the deal language dried up and she was just sitting there looking at him with nothing left in the register to pull from. Then he began. He did not raise his voice. He did not lean forward. He spoke the way a man speaks when he has been holding something for a very long time and has finally decided to set it down in the exact place it belongs. He said he wanted to start with the podcast. He said he had listened to it once in a parking garage in Las Colinas on a Tuesday afternoon on a link a colleague had sent without comment. He said he had sat in his car afterward for a while. He described without theatre what it had felt like to hear his wife tell a host he had never met that he was comfortable but not ambitious, and to hear her laugh while she said it, and to understand that this was not something she had said once and regretted, but something she apparently believed well enough to broadcast. Simone opened her mouth. He continued. He talked about the Sunday dinners. He talked about the specific geometry of those tables, Craig at the center, Yvette distributing her pride in him like a currency, and the space where Everett existed treated as neutral territory at best and negative space at worst. He said he had understood the message clearly. He said he had simply declined to argue with it. He mentioned the lockbox. He said she had tried to donate it to Goodwill. He said he had found it in the box with the lamp she no longer liked and the placemats that had gone out of fashion, and he had taken it out without saying anything and placed it back on the shelf where it remained for 4 years. He said he wanted her to think about what was inside that box while she was making that decision. He said she was welcome to take her time with that thought. Then he told her about Sims Golf Holdings. He told her all of it. The structure, the reserves, the $58 billion valuation, the 30 years Wendell had spent building it lease by lease from a single Permian Basin start. He told her about the lien portfolio and the 3 circled properties on the 1987 survey sitting between them on the table right now. He told her that Craig's entire commercial paper portfolio had been secured against properties where Sims Gulf held the senior position for 4 years. He told her that she had co-signed her brother's operating credit line and that her co-signature had chained her license to his solvency, and that his solvency had always been, without either of them knowing it, dependent on Everett's mercy. He reached into the lockbox and placed Wendell's handwritten letter on the table between them. He did not tell her what it said. He just placed it there, his father's handwriting visible and plain and deliberate, and let it occupy the space. Then he looked at her directly. He said, "You went on a podcast and told the world I was comfortable but not ambitious, Simone. But what you didn't know was that the whole time you were planning your exit, you were sleeping in a house, spending commissions, and building your brother's career on ground that my daddy's name is written all over." The room was absolutely silent. Simone looked at the letter. She looked at the survey. She looked at the red circles. She looked up at Everett and asked, in a voice that had nothing performative left in it, whether any of it could be undone. Everett said nothing. He stood. He picked up the lockbox, empty now of its documents which remained on the table, and he walked to the door. He put his hand on the frame and paused. He turned back once. He said, "Tell your mother I said hello." Then he walked out. The door closed behind him with the quiet, final sound of something that has been decided and will not be revisited. The 1987 survey stayed on the table, the red circles faced the empty chair, and by the time the newsletter published its next issue, the whole city of Dallas would know Wendell Sims's name. 6 months later, the Dallas real estate community had largely moved on. That is how these things work. A name gets attached to a scandal, circulates for a few weeks, becomes shorthand for a cautionary tale, and then fades into the background noise of an industry that is always generating new cautionary tales. By summer, Craig Beaumont was one of those names, mentioned in passing, if at all, as an example of what happens when you build on a foundation you never bothered to investigate. The Texas Department of Savings and Mortgage Lending issued its final determination in March. Craig's license was permanently revoked. Beaumont Mortgage Solutions was formally dissolved the following week. The office on Turtle Creek Boulevard was vacated, the staff dispersed, the files transferred to a compliance administrator. The Porsche was sold at a public auction in April for $31,000. Craig moved back into a rental in Garland and did not announce it to anyone. Simone's 90-day suspension expired in May, but the broker affiliation she had relied on for 11 years did not renew her contract. The firm cited portfolio concerns. She was currently working as an independent agent, rebuilding from scratch, without the listings or the network that had defined her professional identity. Preston announced his engagement in April, a woman named Courtney, a financial analyst from Houston, via a social media post that Simone's cousin Brenda forwarded without comment to 3 people who did not need to see it. Yvette stopped attending her social club in February. The newsletter interview had been shared enough times in enough mocking contexts that showing up in rooms where people had read it had become a different experience than it used to be. She still went to church, she still held herself with the bearing of someone awaiting a portrait commission, but she had stopped pronouncing quite so loudly about what other people deserved. The Dallas Community Connector ran its profile of the Wendell Sims Community Foundation in its June issue. It was a full page. The editor had given it the space it warranted. The photograph that anchored the piece showed the iron lockbox, open now, empty, sitting on a mahogany desk in Everett's Beaumont home office. The caption beneath it read, "What He Left Behind." The article described the foundation's mission, its $50 million endowment, its inaugural scholarship class of 12 first-generation college students from the Beaumont region, all pursuing degrees in petroleum engineering, energy management, or environmental science. It described Wendell Sims in one paragraph: a wildcatter who spent 30 years building something real in deliberate obscurity because he understood that real things do not need an audience. It did not mention Simone. It did not need to. Everett sold the Millbrook Drive house in April. He did not stage it or renovate it. He listed it at fair market value, accepted the first reasonable offer, and closed without ceremony. He packed what he considered his, which was not much relative to what the house contained, and drove south on the interstate toward Beaumont on a Thursday morning in early May, with the windows down and the radio playing a station out of Houston that leaned toward older gospel. He bought a modest house 3 streets from where Wendell's first Permian lease had been drilled. It had a covered porch, a side yard with room for a garden he was not sure he would plant, but liked knowing he could, and a kitchen window that faced east. He moved in with the same lack of drama with which he had moved through every other transition in his life. He unpacked in 2 days. On the 3rd day, he sat on the porch in the morning with coffee and listened to the neighborhood wake up around him and felt, for the first time in a long time, that he was in exactly the right place. The Foundation's first scholarship dinner was held in June at a hotel ballroom in downtown Beaumont. 12 students and their families, board members, community figures, a representative from each of the 4 universities receiving Foundation-sponsored students. Everett sat at the head table and gave a short speech about his father that he had written himself, in longhand, on the back of a legal pad, and had not shown to anyone before delivering it. He met Adrienne Cole at the end of the evening. She was the principal of Beaumont Collegiate Preparatory, and 3 of the 12 scholarship recipients were her students. She had stayed after the formal program ended to speak with their families individually, and when that was done she had found herself standing near the exit at the same moment Everett was walking out. They spoke about the students first, then about the Foundation's direction, then about Beaumont in general. The way it had changed, the ways it had stayed exactly the same. The conversation was unhurried in the way that conversations are when both people have stopped performing for the day. They stood in the parking lot for 40 minutes past when either of them needed to still be there. She did not try to be impressive. He did not try to be interesting. They just talked the way 2 people talk when they are not trying to become something for each other, and when they said goodnight, it was with the mutual understanding that they would speak again. The lockbox sat on the shelf in Everett's new home office. Empty now. All 3 documents properly filed. The certificate with Gerald, the survey in the Foundation's records, and Wendell's letter in a fireproof drawer that Everett had bought specifically for the purpose. The box itself had no legal significance anymore. He kept it anyway. Some things you keep not because they have value, but because they are the shape of the story. And here is the story's shape when you hold it at arm's length and look at it plain. A man who was told for 10 years that he was nothing, sat quietly with everything, waited for the moment that was his to choose, and chose it with the precision and patience of someone who had learned from a father who never once needed the world to know his name. That is not a coincidence. That is not luck. That is what it looks like when a man has been paying attention to the right things for the right reasons, even when nobody was watching. Patience is not weakness, it is the longest game, and some men are built to play it all the way to the end. Now, here is what I want to ask you before you go. If you were Everett Sims, sitting in that car on Christmas Eve with those divorce papers on the seat beside you, knowing everything he knew, what would you have done? Would you have moved as slowly as he did? Or would you have acted sooner? Let me know your answer in the comments, because I read every single one. and this conversation is always better when you are part of it. If this story landed for you tonight, hit that like button one more time before you leave. It costs you nothing and it helps this channel more than you know. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is the time, because we have more stories like this one coming, and you do not want to be the person who missed them. I will see you in the next one.